All right, good morning. My name is Jenna Cullinane-Heggie, and I'm a Deputy Assistant Commissioner here at the Coordinating Board and helping to lead the rollout of regional target work under the 60x30TX strategic plan. I have several colleagues joining me here today, and I'll let them introduce themselves as well.
I'm David Gardner. I'm the Deputy Commissioner for Academic Planning and Policy at the Coordinating Board.
Hi, I'm Luis Martinez. I'm a Data Training Specialist. I'm glad to meet you at the Data Fellows Program.
Hi, I'm Chelsea Moore. I work in strategic planning and funding at the Coordinating Board, and I'm the Metroplex liaison for you guys.
I'm Mary Smith. I'm the Assistant Deputy Commissioner for the Academic and Planning Unit.
Thank you. Well, and I want to thank everyone for their time. We have a great turnout. We have about 30 folks logged in right now, and so really appreciate the next hour that you're going to spend with us while we talk a little bit about, give some background on the regional targets and talk about what we're going to do to move this work forward. So, but I'll start by passing it over to David for a little kind of welcome and introduction.
Well, I really appreciate all of you taking the time out to meet with us today. I know every one of you is very busy and have important responsibilities, which is really why we need you here today. 60x30TX, as you know, is the state's higher education strategic plan. It's getting us to the next level. We've been working very hard since 2000 with closing the gaps, and many of you helped us with our success in closing the gaps. The Metroplex in particular has been very important in terms of showing innovation, great persistence, relentlessness, I think, on many of these topics, and we need you to continue. So I'm glad that you've taken the time out to join us today. We plan on making it productive, and I will alert you that you will continue to hear from us.
Great. Thank you, David. Okay, so we're going to jump right in here. I want to start by just going over the purposes of our time today in this session, and the first is really to engage. So I know I didn't hear from everyone as we were doing the introductions. I know there are a lot more folks I can see logged in than who said hello, but really I'm going to share some information to start this, but there are going to be several points along the way where we really want your input and guidance for how to proceed with this work in the Metroplex. So we hope that this is a forum not only for higher education stakeholders, although presidents and liaisons from all the institutions in the region are included. We also have important representation from our K-12 sector and also from business and industry. We want to introduce the 60x30 regional targets, the process and the supports that will be available to you, and we also want to get your input, as I said, to determine how to mobilize this work in your region. And to get a sense of who's on the call or who's invited to participate in this Metroplex discussion, this first map that you can see on the slide shows all of the institutions of higher education, public and independent institutions that fall in this higher education. This is the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board region for the Metroplex. And I know there are quite a few different kind of regional groups out there with maybe different lines for where they draw, but this is the group that we refer to as the Metroplex. Who else is in the Metroplex? These are the Education Service Center centers. Both Richardson and Fort Worth are included in this group, as are 4 workforce development areas. So Texas Workforce Commission, their groups include North Central, Tarrant County, Dallas, and Texoma, who are also invited to participate in this discussion. So those are the folks that we've reached out to, but we also know there are important players in your region. Might include active P16 councils, collective impact organizations, county or city leaders, chambers of commerce, just as an example of others that might be important to bring to the table as we talk about our goals around educational attainment and the participation of students from high school into higher ed and improving those rates. So now you know kind of who's in the mix. We'll do a little background on the 4 goals of the plan. I'll turn it back over to David.
Thank you. I hope that what I'm going to tell you will be something you already know and can tell me, but assuming not, I think it's important to start out by saying that 60x30TX is actually built on the work of closing the gaps. So while many of the things in closing the gaps are not explicitly mentioned, they do remain important. So I think that's something everybody needs to understand. But because this is a strategic plan, you know, we focus on those things that are new, they're most critical going forward, and it doesn't mean that something that's not included is no longer important, but these are the things that are going to make the most difference going forward. Now, the first goal, educated population, we really need to talk about a couple of minutes, because this is really about the entire 25 to 34-year-old population of Texas. And this is an area where we cannot really achieve our work if we don't have the schools, the colleges and universities, industry all working together, because this educated population will be the result of not just those students that we graduate ourselves, but those that we bring to Texas. About 3 years ago, we imported about 55,000 people who actually helped enhance the educated population in Texas. So we need to have the jobs for our graduates. We need to produce an economy that welcomes folks to the state, who welcomes our graduates. We know we're always going to lose some graduates, but we want to have the job opportunities here. And part of this is about developing the type of economy that stands out in the world in terms of really being a high-skill, high-wage economy. So if we move to the second goal, completion, this is explicitly the product of our colleges and universities in Texas. These are the graduates that they're going to produce. And the goal for 2030 is that year, at least 550,000 students will complete a certificate, an associate, bachelor's, or master's from an institution of higher education in Texas. Now, those of you that were around for Closing the Gaps notice, we're counting masters, which we did not for Closing the Gaps, and the reason for that is there are a number of fields that clearly a master's is required now. The bachelor's isn't enough, and those of you who work at colleges and universities will probably know that yourself, so we won't go into that. But I think more importantly, it's important to understand that 550,000 is the graduates in 2030. If we achieve our targets along the way, we will actually graduate with these credentials, more than 6 million students. So it's not just that 550,000. So imagine the difference another 6 million plus graduates will make to the state, especially if we have the work for them to remain. But to achieve this, as with our previous plan, we have targets for areas and groups that we know will make a difference. If we don't specifically address the completions of Hispanics, African Americans, more male students, and particularly economically disadvantaged students. Economically disadvantaged students are a growing part of our population, and we need to be better than anyone at helping those students graduate. And the long-term prospect is, as we help those students achieve higher education credentials, every generation we should have fewer and fewer economically disadvantaged students, which will enable more people to be prepared for the workforce to pay for their own education. So, very critical goal. The third goal is marketable skills. When we developed this goal, we were aware nationally, many of you have heard about how many students are not getting jobs, complaints about preparation. We believe that many of our students, if not all of our students, have marketable skills, but they may not be aware of them. So when we talk about marketable skills, it's not just skills that they need in the workforce, but helping students understand what skills they actually have, how to market themselves going forward. Anecdotally, I know of a sociology graduate that recently took a job for a tech firm and is making a good salary, but most sociology majors would not know that they could do that. Student debt, this is tied in with marketable skills. I think it's that we don't want our students who have debt for it to exceed more than 60% of their first-year wages. And staff did a lot of work to understand this, but it's important to note that a little less than half of our students actually have debt when they graduate. And the population needs to know that. They assume everybody's accruing a lot of debt. The debt is, for university graduates, is about $31,000. For community college graduates, is about $12,000 or $13,000. So these are things we need to educate people on, but we need to work on that. So if we move forward to the workforce, we know that there's more and more demand for higher education in the workforce. Georgetown has talked a lot about this, and you see on this chart the number of jobs that were created during the financial recovery between 2010 and 2016 that required different levels of education. And you'll see the preponderant number required at least an associate or higher. And I think that's important to know. We don't have on here, but also if you look at the unemployment rates during that period, the folks with college credentials had a much lower unemployment rate. Either they could get a job as fired or they maintained their job. So the next chart will specifically addresses the Metroplex and the jobs, the graduates needed for various jobs in the area, particularly in the health sector. So James Drake's on the phone. He'll be particularly familiar with this, I think. But you have two columns. The first column talks about the actual numbers of jobs. So you'll see the first five by jobs, and then at the bottom is those that are highest in percent growth. So I think that won't be surprising to those of you, particularly that are working at the institutions, but it's just a reminder, and we think it's useful to share with your base. The next chart really talks about income. And part of what we're wanting to do is to make sure that more and more of a population has a living wage. And this chart makes this point very clearly. So what you see here are people who graduated from schools in your area, but they may have gone to college in a different part of Texas. And the salary figures here reflect wherever they got the job. They may have gone to work in DFW. They may have gone to work in Weslaco. But I think you can see clearly there's a payoff after 10 years in terms of the difference between having a high school diploma and having a certificate, an associate's, or a bachelor's degree. So I think that sums that up, and turn it over to Jenna.
Well, thank you, David. And as I have been out and about talking about the 60x30 text plan, I think that it may feel like sometimes we're preaching to the choir, but I think it's important to get a grounding, especially in kind of the economic and workforce connections, because really not everyone has the same set of beliefs, and it is important to continue to make the case about a living wage, and I think not only your first job, but what is the preparation you need to throughout your career and your life, and what sort of education will help provide that kind of living wage job. So now I want to jump into the regional targets and provide a little bit of an overview about the work that we're doing here. So as we've been through a legislative session now, the plan has been out for a couple of years, by and large we hear a very high level of support for the plan. People generally say these are the right issues for the state, these are the most important priorities, we really want to be thinking in a student-centered way, we want to be monitoring student debt, we want to be thinking about marketable skills in the workforce, and we want to grow the level of education in our population. But pretty quickly after that, folks say, well, you know, how are we going to get there? These are some pretty ambitious goals. How are we going to get to that 60%? That's a long way from where we are at 41% right now. And so staff here have been thinking about how do we kind of grow the stakeholder group who's thinking about these goals. So one of the challenges, how do we bring not only higher education partners to the table, but those K-12 workforce and also those intermediaries like philanthropic groups, research organizations, other community-based organizations who help really drive improvement in higher education and beyond. And so this regional work really came out of a desire to provide more guidance about some of the structures and strategies that can help move us towards our goals, and also to bring together that larger higher education ecosystem. We want to approach this work regionally because we think it helps kind of thread the needle on providing guidance about state-level priorities, but not so prescriptive that it stifles local innovation or doesn't take advantage or recognize the differences between regions and institutions. So we know there's quite a bit of diversity across our big state, but that within regions there is a lot of commonality. For example, in high school feeder patterns. So statewide, we know about 80% of high school graduates stay in their region for higher education. So certainly some people go out of state, folks maybe go to institutions outside of their region, but when we think about designing for the majority, the vast majority of our high school students stay locally when they move into higher education. And the same pattern is true for transfer. We know that students are very mobile these days, and they come in and out of institutions, but largely that mobility is happening within a geographic area. Also, the local labor market. There are big differences whether you're in the Gulf Coast Metroplex or up in the High Plains. There are different kinds of employment opportunities, but that institutions of higher education locally are best connected to the needs and demands of that workforce. We also think by approaching this work regionally, that institutional strategic planning will be improved. So if part of our goal to increase completion involves growing your enrollment, for instance, but that enrollment growth is taken from a neighboring institution as a region and as a state, we haven't raised all boats. So we want to think a little bit more broadly about how do we kind of move the needle in the state. And we also hope that this work will encourage some of the tactical planning. While we haven't specifically just, laid out how many certificates or bachelors we need, we think that working in collaboration with K-12 and in your business and industry partners, you'll be able to develop those kinds of plans to think about, do we need more folks at the associate level, and what programs, where do we need to grow, and what's the emphasis? So the scope of this regional target work is limited. So David described all 4 of the goals, and there are several targets under those goals. But we have selected just 3 areas. 1, because we want to keep this manageable, and 2, because these really lend themselves to this kind of regional approach. So the 3 areas that we've identified are the big 60 by 30 educated population goal. And that one really fits a regional perspective because that's not even something we would begin to attribute to an individual institution. So we really look at this only statewide and regionally, because if we think about the level of education in the Metroplex, we wouldn't say that's directly the responsibility of Dallas County Community College or UT Dallas or any one institution. We would say that it's going to be all of the institutions in your region, all the institutions around the state or out of state where people might migrate in and now live in the Metroplex area. So we want to think really broadly because this is a broad goal. We also included the overall completion goal of the 550,000 certificates, associates, bachelor's, and master's degrees. This is included because it's both ambitious and large in that people say, well, what's my piece of the puzzle? How many should I be contributing? So this is one we get probably the most questions about from institutions, kind of wanting more guidance about where their planning should go. And then the third area is the 65% high school to higher education direct enrollment rate. This is another one where what we're tracking here is students who graduate from high school in your area in the Metroplex, and do they come into higher education, that could be a public institution or an independent institution, the following fall after they graduate from high school. Right now, we're at about 52%, we're aiming for 65%. This one is also included because it works really well on a regional basis. Again, we wouldn't say, if you think of all the high school graduates in the Metroplex, that any one institution is responsible for all of those students. It's the global enrollment kind of across all the institutions. So what are we asking regions to do? So in these 3 areas, we're asking regions to bring together institutions and other stakeholders to identify at least one powerful strategy in each of these 3 areas. So for the educated population, for the completion goal, and for that high school to higher ed direct enrollment rate, what is one strategy that you think would measurably move the needle and help you get to those aims? The second issue, or second request, is to set numeric targets by institution for completion. So that's only for the number 2 there, completion goal 550,000. We are going to be giving a preliminary regional number for that, but asking institutions to look at past performance, to consider their plans for growth, and to identify where they will be by 2030. So a quick timeline to give you a sense of where we are in the work. We began piloting this work with one region in the fall, and that was South Texas. We had a webinar with them just like this, and they're in the process now of organizing some in-person convenings to actually start identifying their strategies and having discussions about their institutional completion targets. We've provided some support already and have plans for additional support. Our Data Fellows trainings, and I've noticed several folks on the call today are participated in our Data Fellows training. This is something that we've been organizing with support from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to bring people in to help them understand and utilize and access our state data resources. But part of what we did is we've organized a data workbook for each region, and we had the Data Fellows actually come together and dig into exactly the measures that I just talked about to look at past performance and projections for the future. So you have some data phone-a-friends already in your region. So we have several representatives that are in the Metroplex, and I'll introduce those folks in a little bit. We've also developed a starter kit, and I'll show you where that is in a few slides. And here we are now, January, February, in the midst of these kickoff webinars. So the remaining 9 regions, we're just kind of introducing and rolling this out now. In March and April, we'll be holding our annual accountability meetings. Something that we're going to do a little bit different this year is we've always brought people together to talk about our accountability measures and progress by sector. And we're still going to have some sector-based conversations, but we're also going to spend a little bit of time one afternoon and overlap at least the community technical colleges and universities to have some regional discussions about strategies that lead to kind of measurable improvement in these areas. By May, we hope that the preliminary regional target numbers that I'm about to share with you will become official. We wanted to have a couple of months for folks to dig into the data, review, and let us know if they see if they have questions or issues related to it. By about May, we'd like to kind of firm those up so we can start planning for at least a couple of years. David always talks about how this is a living plan. And absolutely, as data become available and if trends change, we're happy to revisit these, but do want to have a couple of years where we can kind of lock these in. And then finally, by August, we would like the submission forms, which would identify those 3 strategies and the institutional targets by August of 2018. So I've just shared a lot of information with you and want to kind of pause here and take a couple of minutes and go ahead and open up the phone line if you have muted yourself or if you want to type in the chat, either way. Would love to hear what questions you have about either the plan or the regional target approach that I've talked about so far.
So this is Morgan from Tarleton. With regards to the regional targets, are each institution going to be responsible for we'll say a set specific number, or is it, how do we as singular institutions know kind of what we need to contribute to the overall regional number?
Good question. So I'm going to show you in just a minute the regional target number for the Metroplex. And then what we'd like you to do is all the institutions to come together, probably in an in-person or a virtual way, to identify, here's what we think we can contribute based on, and as I said, we have a kind of a data workbook to help talk to you about or show the trends for the past, and hopefully can inform some of those discussions. Okay, anyone else? Okay, I'm going to keep moving, but feel free to, again, type in the chat, or we'll have some additional opportunities for discussion in a few minutes. So now I want to go through the preliminary regional targets. The first is the 60 by 30 educated population goal, and what you can see in this table is the percent of Texans ages 25 to 34 with a certificate or degree. You'll see all 10 of the regions represented in their different kind of color coding there. And then across the bottom, the statewide numbers. So as I mentioned before, statewide, the most recent year that we have available, 2015, we're at 41%. We are aiming for 48, 54, and ultimately 60% in 2030. So same for all of the regions. You can see the most recent actual, followed by the projections in 5-year increments. So for the Metroplex, you can see that you are currently above the state average at 45%, and that over time, by 2030, that we have you at 65%. Now, some of you may be saying, hey, wait, I thought we were aiming for 60%. Now we have 65%. What we did here is, what we wanted to do is, ultimately, we hope every region will be aiming for that 60%. We would love to see every region stretch to that level. But we also want to recognize that some places are further ahead than others in terms of where they're starting. We have a range from 29% up to 48% currently. And so what we did as a projection is what's kind of the minimum amount of growth we would need to see from each region based on where they're starting to get to that 60% overall. So you'll see some of the large metropolitan areas, Metroplex, Central Texas, et cetera, are above the 60%, but that is kind of what we need to get to the average overall. Next is the completion goal, and what you'll see here, again, same situation in terms of the data. You're seeing the 2016 most recent data available for the number of certificates, associates, bachelor's, and master's degrees. So in 2016, statewide, we were about 321,000, and ultimately heading to that 550,000. For the Metroplex, you'll see, like some of the other very populated kind of urban centers, there are quite a few completions in the Metroplex, Gulf Coast, Central Texas, and in South Texas. So for Metroplex specifically, it's 136,870 is the projection for you for 2030. And then looks like we have a question here. Sorry, I'll come back to it in just a moment, if that's okay. So for high school to higher education enrollment, again, we're looking at the percent of Texas public high school graduates who enroll in an institution of higher education in the state of Texas. So either public 4-year, public 2-year, independent institution, HRI, inclusive in the 4 years there. So any of those type of institutions, we are currently at 52% statewide for 2016, ultimately aiming for 65%. And you'll see we have a range of about 48% up to 57% currently, and by 2030 that range is about 61% to 71%. In the Metroplex, you're slightly above or slightly below the average for the state right now at 51%, and ultimately moving up to 64% by 2030. One thing I want to point out, we've had some questions about who we're counting. So for completions, we are looking at anyone, how we're defining the region is anyone who's at an institution of higher education in your region. So this is going to include your out-of-region people, your out-of-state people, your international folks, folks of any age. If they're completing at your institution, we're counting them. On the flip side, for high school to higher education enrollment, here's where we're really focusing on the students who graduated from high school in your region. And again, they could go to higher education anywhere in the state. As long as we can track them, we'll count them. But we're doing this intentionally. We want to both count the folks who are coming through K-12 in your area and think about their progression. And we also want to look at the higher ed side and think about everyone that you educate. So those are intentionally different, but I just want to make sure that nuance is clear. So we'll stop again. I think there are some questions coming in from the chat, so I'll start there, but also we'll open it up if you have questions. So we have, ESC 11 is ready to host a meeting here on our campus. When might we discuss some dates, or our regional schools might gather with you? So I love this. ESC 11 will be in couple more slides. I'm going to open this up, and we can talk about some of the options for convening. But this is exactly what we're hoping to get out on this webinar, is some volunteers who want to help pick up the torch here. Since we're looking at a snapshot of where 25 to 34-year-olds have a certificate, associates, or bachelor's by 2030, should we be concentrating efforts on current high school students? And what about dual credit? Do you count completions from dual credit? So there's a little bit of mixing here. I just want to point out that when we're looking at the 25 to 34-year-olds, we're focused on the overall level of education. That's the educated population goal. when we're talking about certificates, associates, bachelor's, and master's completion, we're talking about the completion goal, which does not have an age restriction. So I just want to make sure that's really clear. And should we be concentrating efforts on our current high school students? So partially by having the high school to higher ed direct enrollment rate in here, we are suggesting, yes, this is a very important priority looking at this population coming in. We know that the direct from high school students are most likely to be college ready, and not that it is important to support and educate students no matter their age and whenever they're coming back to higher education. That's why we're counting them as part of the completion goal, but we also want to stay focused on the high school to higher ed. So.
Yeah, this is David. I just want to add in, let's not forget we have thousands of students who have completed numerous hours at our community colleges and universities who have not graduated, and so we would like to get as many of them through to completion as possible. So this does not vary what Jenna was saying at all, but we need to remember that we have many thousands of students who have invested in themselves, and the state has invested in them, and many of them have debt, and they haven't realized the real payoff yet. And so we can help you with that as well.
Mm-hmm. So I think what we're trying to do is across these three areas, you know, we're focused on kind of that younger workforce population for the educated population goal. We're looking at all students for the completion goal who complete in your region or attend school, higher education in your region, and then that third area of that high school to higher ed direct population. So across the three, really trying to blanket all the key populations in our state. Not that other ones aren't key if I said that exclusively. Okay, so other questions, anyone, those are the ones from the chat. Anyone else have questions that they want to raise out loud? So completions from dual credit. Yes, if someone completes via dual credit, so in 2016, for example, if someone completed a certificate or an associate's through dual credit, absolutely, those count. So they don't have to be in a target age group or anything like that. If an institution of higher education confers a credential, you're in the count. Okay. So next I'm going to talk a little bit about some resources that we have available to support this work. So the first there are some human resources to help you. You'll see here a photo of all of our regional points of contact. So folks who are in the Data Fellows training already had a chance to meet their regional point of contact, but we have a staff person assigned for each region. And you can see Chelsea in the blue sweater over towards the left, and she is your point person. So you can feel free to reach out to me at any time, and Chelsea will be helping, and you'll see her name in your inbox, I'm sure, very soon. There are also the Data Fellows, who I mentioned before. Here are the folks, we had both a 2-year group and a 4-year group come together, and you can see the folks who came in for our training. And so, as I said, these are the folks that you should feel free to call up and say, after this, and say, we need some help, or we want to dig into this, or what else do you know about this? So these are folks to call, and they also know who to get in touch with here if you have any data questions as you start to climb into the target. We've also developed a starter kit. I'll show you where that is on our website. We have kind of a nice 2.0 version, but you can look forward to a very a prettier 3.0 version that's going through design right now. What it includes are things like suggested stakeholders. So this is the group of, right now, it's presidents and liaisons from higher education institutions. It's folks, TEA contacted the education service centers and asked for representatives. We also have chairs and executive directors from the workforce development boards included. This is just, as I'll say probably several times, just a place to start. This is not exclusive. We want you to add to this, subtract to this as makes the most sense. But rather than send someone on a mission to gather a bunch of email addresses, we wanted to give you a place to start. We've also provided guidance for collaboration and negotiation. I'll talk a little bit about that going forward. So what does it look like after we hang up on this webinar? What are we going to do next? There's some suggested steps. There's also that data workbook that I mentioned. And there's a set of sample regional strategies. So I talked about that we're going to be asking you for a strategy in each of these 3 areas. And the characteristics of what we're looking for is something that's relevant to one of these 3 areas, high impact, and large scale. And I know when I'm starting something new and a little bit nebulous, it helps to have some examples to start from, and these are in no way exhaustive, just some ideas to get you started. What you'll notice as you look at those is that we're trying to highlight efforts and initiatives that might already be underway. This is not something that you need to start fresh, or this is a brand new add-on. What we hope is that this will be an opportunity for your region to identify some assets or strategies that are already in place that you might be able to do bigger or more intentionally connected to the 60x30 plan, or more intentionally connected to some of the targets that we're talking about. That is included in the starter kit, and then also what a submission form will look like. We'll have something probably in a digital format for folks to complete, but right now just a paper sample. This is a little bit more detail about some of the suggested steps for moving the regional target work forward. So while the coordinating board is kicking this off, we are really asking regions to pick up the torch here and lead this work. We'll be asking for volunteers to help convene and facilitate. We really want you to own these discussions. We don't want to direct them, but we want to be in a supporting role for what you need. So congratulations, we're in number 1 right now. You have joined the webinar. And if any of your colleagues have missed this, we're going to send the recording and the slides out afterwards, so you'll have those available to share. The next step is to organize a virtual or in-person convening, and we have some advice about who you might include in terms of attendance, when to meet, who should host, who should facilitate, again, as examples. We have a sample agenda, totally customizable, change and edit as you wish, or scrap and do your own, that's totally fine. And so it just gives you a sense of, in one kind of longer meeting or maybe a series of meetings, what kinds of issues you might want to discuss to move this forward. Then convene and share your progress. So there's additional detail, and I'll show you where those are. Actually, I think the slide's not in this one. So on 60x30TX.com, if we have a few minutes at the end, I'll show you where that link is. So 60x30TX.com, under Resources, there is a landing page for Regional Target Starter Kit, and under there is where you will find information customized for your region. So discussion. Again, want to open it up, feel free to use the chat or just speak up. We'd love to hear from you. So we've developed preliminary targets for the Metroplex as a whole region. And how do you recommend operationalizing the strategy work and the institutional target work? And this can go in a couple of different directions. In South Texas, their discussion was really about geographic organization. So they said, they range all the way up from San Antonio all the way down to the lower Rio Grande Valley, and they said, we're too big, we're very geographically spread out, we really need to break this up. So they decided that they were going to have one kind of working group in the San Antonio area, one in the lower Rio Grande Valley, and then one that kind of cuts across Laredo, Kingsville, Corpus Christi. So that's what their discussion centered on. I think so there's a geographic question, there is organizationally, do you think an institution might host, an ESC might host, or maybe a P16 council or other? And would that be different by different target areas? So I'm going to stop talking now and say, okay, so there's something coming in on the chat, so I'll read that and then want to also open it up on the phone line. Please feel free to chime in. So on the chat it says, have you talked to NTCCC and Dr. Christine Hubbard to assist in organizing a meeting? So I think NTCCC is a very nice recommendation, and they are a great example of a highly functioning regional cooperative group. So I know that they primarily have a community college audience organized by UNT, and I have shared this work with Christine Hubbard, and she's had us present some information at she had an assessment conference in the fall, and there's another conference coming up later this week where we're just sharing information. But if that's something that you would like, as I said, we don't want to make the call on what's kind of the best organizing unit for you all, but if that is something, and I'd love to hear other people's reactions to that suggestion, is that, a group that might that we might leverage to do some of this organization? Or are there other ideas? We also heard from ESC 11 saying they would be happy to bring folks together. Let me ask you this. Are there any other regional groups or convenings that are already happening that make sense to consider? And we don't have to make a final decision today by any means. We're just looking for suggestions about how best to organize folks. I'm using my teacher patience right now. The pregnant pause. Okay.
Maybe asking me some data fellows that have any idea.
Yeah, are there, there is a P16 council for the region. Okay. And what do folks think about some of those options? So we have an ESC on the table, we have P16 council, we have NTCCC. Are there advantages or disadvantages to any of those that you'd like to express? Okay, the HERC is another option. NTCCC and ESC 11 have partnered together several times, and both of us are on the NTRP16 Executive Board. I'm not familiar with NTRP16. But perhaps folks on the call are. North Texas Regional P16. Ah, okay. Okay. I think those are some viable options. I have one more question for you, and perhaps this will kind of continue the discussion. So we actually need either a person or a small group of people who we can communicate with to help provide support and push forward some planning. Are there particular folks that you would like to volunteer or that you would suggest we use as our contacts to help operationalize the work? Okay, are there any data fellows that want to chime in? I know you've had a little more time to think about some of this work since our discussions in November. So we had a question, is this not the data fellows? So the data fellows are, I think they are important contacts, and I would be happy to kind of work with and through them to help make some of these decisions. I would say that there is, not every institution is represented, which is fine. This can be kind of an ad hoc group to help, just set the table for additional discussions and then bring everyone back in for the actual convening to weigh in on some of this. I'm curious to hear from the data fellows about, I think we have Courtney and David perhaps on about being willing to take on that role. Okay, so we have Marlon Moat from Tarrant County, also a data fellow, thank you, from Tarrant County, who's willing to help be one of our contacts to help with the organization. Thank you. Barbara Lerner at TW is willing to help organize, a charter member of the Regional P16 Council. Fantastic, thank you, Barbara. And anyone else who wants to chime in? Mostly we have folks chiming in via the chat, but also feel free to say hello if you'd like. Okay. All right, well, I think that we have, I really appreciate the folks who, we've got another one, Andrew Fisher. So I think folks who either made a suggestion about a particular organization or a particular person, so Andrew Fisher from NCTC, also willing to help, that what we'll do is kind of after this is a general follow-up for everyone who's in the region, again, those contacts we've been contacting, plus anyone who was on the webinar today, to kind of recap what we heard, and also some specific follow-up to those folks who said that they would be willing to help in an organizational role. So I really appreciate that, and we can work with that smaller group to maybe present some options to the larger group and make some final decisions about kind of dates and when and how we want to organize folks. And we'll also follow up, like I said, with Christine Hubbard, NTCCC, and talk about the P16 Council, as well as ESC players about how to move this forward. So I appreciate the input, and I really thank you for volunteering. What we'll do, as I said, you'll see one email that'll be general, and then one specifically to the folks who we've heard from. So stay tuned for that. That wrap-up email will include the slides, a link to the webinar, a participant list updated with folks who joined us today, and some materials that I'll link you to the starter kit. And since we have just a couple of extra minutes here, what I'm going to do is send us over to the 60x30 web page, so you can see right where the regional information is. Okay, 60x30TX.com. And if you go here under resources, you'll see regional target starter kit. And you'll see the Metroplex information is already here. And you can refer to some of the materials that I described. And just to wrap up, I want to thank you again for your time today. I want to thank you for the efforts that you have already put in and will continue to do, and I look forward to working with you as we go forward to achieve the goals of the plan. So thank you so much. If there's anything else, email Chelsea or myself, and we'd be happy to follow up with you. Have a great day.